Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Kvetching with Adam and Jared. This is Jared, and that is Adam.
I'm Adam.
I realized on one of our previous podcasts, I don't know if it was the last one or the one before, I actually said I am Jared and I am Adam. I
I
actually,
noticed that. What was
yeah.
with that?
I don't know which one was that? What episode was that?
I think it was the last one.
Oh, well, that was after 9 p.m. that we recorded, and I'd had a couple of
Uh,
drinks at that point. So I'm gonna,
we have a guest who needs to
Yeah,
introduce her.
absolutely. So we have our guest Naya Lekht here tonight, and she is a Jewish educator, speaker, and thought leader.
Wait a minute, Jared. Naya is supposed to introduce
I'm
herself.
just reading one tagline. I'm not doing the rest of the introduction. She's going to do the rest
All
of
right,
it.
Naya.
Yeah. So we turn the mic over to her.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me. My favorite topic is kvetching. So I'm here to kvetch with y'all, but yeah, I'd love to do a short intro of who I am. I know you guys know who I am, but perhaps other people don't. So I was born in the former Soviet Union, and I say this not because, it's so cool that I was, but I think that being born in a country that had institutional anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, really. I understand I can understand and identify modern manifestations of anti-Semitism, which is today's anti-Zionism. Now, I didn't grow up in the Soviet Union. I left when I was 6. So I didn't really experience the Soviet Union in the way that somebody who, I don't know, went to school there, I didn't. But my parents did. And so I was raised on their stories. Maybe we'll get into that a bit later. And their stories really encompass what we would call kind of street level anti-Semitism, but also anti-Semitism coming from the state. And really right after the 60s, within the 70s and 80s, quite a bit of anti-Zionism rhetoric in the Soviet Union. But so we came to America, we came to Los Angeles. My parents were secular, not very religious at all, but they sent me to a Jewish day school. That's really where I got a lot of my Jewish foundational kind of religious education. I learned Hebrew there, and I went to college I'm going to date myself. I went to college in 2001, 2002. And I didn't experience like any anti-Semitism growing up. I went to a Jewish day school. I went to a public school that was predominantly lots of Jewish students. And then I go to
In Los Angeles, right?
Yeah, in Los Angeles. And I go to college, and the college that I went to undergrad was UC Santa Cruz. And just so for people to understand, UC Santa Cruz is a hippie school. Okay, let's just put it this way. It's a pretty hippie school, anti-establishment, anti-industrial complex, all that language. And when I was there, it was my sophomore year, it was right after 9/11. And what I understand now, looking back, I believe that if I had to date, anti-Zionism on college campuses in the United States of America, it's really after 9/11 and after the Second Intifada. These two events collided, and they really produced this new variant, new beat for the United States, not new because the Soviet Union already had it, but new for the United States variant of anti-Semitism, which was anti-Zionism. And I saw it, and of course, what I saw, I knew it was anti-Semitism, not because I was some scholar on, the history of anti-Semitism, but only because of what my parents had told me about what the Soviets would tell through their newspapers, through different channels to the Soviet citizens about the big bad, quote unquote, Israel or Zionists. And I remember I would go to Jewish professors, and I would go to even the Hillel rabbi at my campus, and I would try to explain to them that, guys, this isn't, healthy, robust criticism of Israel. This is really anti-Semitic territory. And I got really two very alarming responses. One that I got as an undergraduate was, well, it's just anti-Zionism, and anti-Zionism is a political disagreement around.
That's the Hillel rabbi who said that?
That's the Hillel rabbi, yes.
It's not good.
And that same Hillel rabbi, by the way, also told me, just don't make a big deal. Don't call attention to this, because if you do, you're just going to endanger the well-being of Jewish students on campus. It's just going to blow over. Well, it didn't blow over, because it's now 20 plus years, and it's gotten much worse. this was, remember, this is 2001, 2002. This is even before BDS was operational on college campuses. So anyway, I did a lot of college activism at my university together with another Russian-speaking Jewish student. So together we formed a group and we really rocked the boat. We brought speakers like Itamar Marcus and Dennis Prager and Robert Spencer.
Oh, Dennis Prager must have gone over well at Santa Cruz.
Oh, it was terrible because I won't ever forget this one professor, I think of gender studies, right after he had finished speaking, there was a line of people who had wanted to ask questions or really mouth off at him. And this one professor, she broke down crying and saying that his presence is a threat to her existence.
Good God.
I
Is she still alive and prospering today?
I don't know.
Well,
I remember one time he was scheduled to speak somewhere in California. I don't remember where it was. It could have been UCLA. I don't remember. And there was a huge outrage over it, that this is a racist, this is a bigot, and they added he's an anti-Semite. These people had no idea who this man even was.
Yeah.
If they're calling him an anti-Semite, this man who is like, has written tons of books on Judaism.
Well, the lefties call Bibi an anti-Semite, so there's always a way to, kind of stretch that out. Look, I'm no fan of Dennis Prager. I think he's very simplistic in his thinking, but he's well within the bounds of legitimate discourse. I mean, you can't have certainly not a violent protest, and you can't claim that this guy's presence is harming you in any sort of way.
No,
he's not getting up there and telling you to attack Muslim students or anything like that.
Right. But I think that they had never heard anybody vocalize or articulate that the position that he had come to say, and whether it was simplistic and whether he's not the most nuanced thinker, that's not the point. The point is that I was so foolish. I really thought, even until grad school, and I'll tell you guys about grad school, I thought that universities truly were a place for where free discourse was encouraged, where people really would where you have ideas, they would kind of duke it out, the great idea would win. But the truth of the matter is that sadly, universities are all about safety, and it's an echo chamber. It's all about, safe spaces and creating these, as I say, echo chambers where we only hear what we want to hear and we don't allow any other perspective. So I think when he came and spoke, it was such a shock because for two reasons. One, I don't think they had ever heard someone articulate it, and two, that it was in their space and they felt threatened. So anyway, that was.
And I met you during your first year of grad school, right? That's when we had that workshop at yeah. That should have been an eye-opening experience for you right then and there. That's when Sasha the Twerp made his official announcement to the world that he is Sasha the Twerp.
By the way, I'm not going to make a big deal out of it, but I would not call him simplistic. I would say that he's very good at getting to the heart of the matter and out all of the nonsense that's irrelevant.
I completely agree with you. I really do. But at the same time, Adam, a lot of people do think that he's simplistic. But that we can discuss that as well. But I don't think he's so simplistic. Does he view the world in a binary that there's good and there is bad in the world? Yes, he does. And I'm sorry, there is. October 7th is a prime example that there is evil in this world. Is that simplistic? I don't know.
No, I'm not saying he's simplistic in everything that comes out of his mouth. I'm just saying a lot of the stuff that I've read from him. I mean, yes, I would agree that
he's not an academic.
He's not an academic, right? He's not.
So as an activist, he does well at what he does.
He's a polemicist.
Correct.
He does well. He does very well at that. I'm not going to disagree with that. But as an academic, I have to point out the fact that he's a polemicist.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a place for people like him. I'm not disparaging him in that sense.
Okay. Well, anyway, so while I was an undergrad, in addition to all that activism that I was doing as a student, I also began to fall in love with Russian literature. And so I was like, I'm going to go and pursue a PhD in Russian literature. And I'll tell a story to you too in a bit about my dissertation. Just in a little bit, but I just want to continue the conversation about my story as a Jewish activist. I go to grad school and, I'm studying Russian literature. My first year is quite uneventful. I did learn Old Church Slavonic. I had to take Old Church Slavonic. That was fun. And
I don't even know what that is.
It's the language of the Russian Orthodox Church that goes back, much like Latin.
Proto-Slavic, you know.
Okay. Mhm.
Anyway, and so around my third or fourth year, I started to realize that I want to probably write about something to do with Russian Jewish identity via literature. And so none of the professors on my department in the Russian department knew anything about, you know, Russian Jewish identity, literature, culture, and et cetera. So they said, go to the history department, and, you know, there's a really robust Center for Jewish Studies at UCLA. And I took a class as a graduate student. It was, I don't know, like Introduction to Jewish History or something like that. And it was led by, at that time, he was the director of the Center for Jewish Studies and perhaps even the department chair of history, and that was David Myers.
He's still the director of Jewish Studies.
Oh, he still is.
I
Wow.
think
No,
he is,
I
yeah.
think,
I
really?
thought it was Dov Waxman.
He's head of the
No,
new
Waxman is the
Nazarian Center for Israel
Israel
Studies.
Studies.
Yeah, it's a subset. I don't know the relationship between the two, but Waxman's only been there for a few years, and the center's only been there for a few years.
Yeah.
So in any case, it was actually a very good class, because that was where I learned, we read Salo Baron and Greats, and I was introduced to diaspora nationalism, Dubnov. It was actually a wonderful historiography of Jewish, you know, Jewish thinkers, Jewish historians. And as we were going into the more, I would say, modern period, and when I say that, I mean like the 20th century, he and another colleague, it was co-taught by Sarah Stein, decided to teach on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, they called it the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I prefer to call it the Arab-Israeli conflict. And they assigned Ilan Pappé's books. And it was about one book was on the ethnic cleansing and the Nakba and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. And I was sitting there and I was fuming because I was so angry. Okay, I said, fine. I said, you know what? That's okay. They want to talk about the Arabs, they want us to read, but why are we only getting one perspective? What about another perspective? And at that time, I was watching, I don't know if both of you know this. Do you guys know who Pierre Rehov is?
No.
Pierre Rehov is a French Jewish filmmaker. Mostly he makes documentary films, but about jihad and about the conflict in the Middle East. And he had made a film called The Road to Janine, which is a very powerful documentary about Janine and the Second Intifada, I believe. And I remember I emailed David Myers and Sarah Stein, and I think my email was probably not the most gentle. And I said, you know, fine, you want us reading Ilan Pappé, that's okay. But there are other important voices that I think the students in the class should also be introduced to. And I said, how about we watch a film by Pierre Rehov? Okay, Pierre Rehov is not an academic, he's not a historian. So he calls me, he's like, he tells me, I want to talk to you in my office. The next day I come to his office and he scolds me and he tells me.
This is David Myers.
Yes, David Myers. And he basically warns me very strongly. There's a strong warning. And he says, listen, you're just starting. You're a junior scholar, not even. You're a grad student, right? You're going to go on the job market. The last thing you want to be, he goes, I really want to urge you to think very hard about the kind of scholar you want to be, because the last thing you would want to be is an activist. And
well, I think there's a certain truth to that. I mean, it will hurt you on the job market if you're.
I agree with that, actually. I'm not in disagreement with that, okay? But the whole irony in all of that, Jared, is that, do you know what he ended up doing?
I'm well aware of what David Myers does, yes.
Okay, he then became the director of the New Israel Fund, which is basically anti-Israel activism.
The End Israel Fund is
but how is recommending this documentary Road to Janine activism? It's maybe activist, it's academic activism, right? Like you're trying to actively.
So is Ilan Pappé. That's not unbiased historiography in any, you know.
I think that it was my delivery, perhaps, because he said you have a lot of chutzpah. But he used that word. He goes, you have a lot of chutzpah telling me and Professor Stein how to teach this class and which sources we should we should use. And I said, that's not what I meant. I remember I said, I'm just suggesting that if you're going to give such a biased, as you pointed out, just such a biased secondary source on the history of Israel and 1948, I'd like to see something else as well. And I remember he goes, well, you've got some chutzpah.
Okay, well, number one, we're going to call this episode Hutzpah with Adam and Jared, because I
Okay.
think that works. Adam,
But
you're getting a little blurry
So,
again. I
so
have to point
basically,
this.
he was mansplaining.
I guess, I don't know.
I think he would have said it to a woman too, but to a man also. But anyway,
I don't
but the
know.
thing is,
But
this was
here,
hold
here,
on, this
I'm
was
gonna
an
jump in.
undergrad or a graduate class.
This was grad class. This was
It
a
was
grad.
so, and it was big. It wasn't just Zionism, right? It was a Jewish
Oh,
history,
Jewish history.
historiography. Okay, well, you know, if we're looking at canonical figures in
Oh.
Jewish historiography, Ilan Pappé should be nowhere near that list. He should be.
Well, he was very near
He's
that list. He was in
completely
that.
inappropriate for that syllabus in every respect.
So it was really, it was kind of, it was very difficult for me, because then right after, he and I had I guess a vexed relationship, and he kind of stopped talking to me. And he was supposed to be on my committee for my dissertation, and he didn't want to be on the committee. And kind of completely disengaged himself from mentoring me. And that's fine.
All because you recommended that movie.
Well, that, and I think because I was pretty, you could say, aggressive in the fact that I wrote them an email saying, you know, I think that you should be teaching, if you're going to teach about this, then you should also include other sources. And I think that certain people think that, you know, how dare I, just a, you know, a grad student, write to their a professor suggesting that the professor re-examine his or her reading list. But I also think that my Zionism, and that's when I, you know, that's when I returned to quote unquote Zionist activism. I think that rubbed him the wrong way. I think that, you know, well, it's funny because he calls himself a Zionist. You know, this is like the biggest enigma for me is that he actually calls himself and I, you know, thinks of himself as a Zionist. But when he writes in the LA Times, for instance, the things that he writes are just, I don't know in what universe he thinks that that is helpful. But we don't, like, we're spending, yes, but we're spending a lot of time on him. I just want, this is a long intro of like who I am and what I do. So I devoted a lot of my academic career to the study of the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. And as I was teaching at UCLA as a lecturer after I finished my PhD, I taught a class on the history of the Holocaust. And as I was lecturing, I remember that I was telling students things like very basic things, like, okay, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, blood libel. I was referencing these terms. And I remember looking at my students and I thought, I don't think they understand what I just said. Like, I don't think they've ever heard, and this is the year 2000, just to date this is about 2016. And I was like, guys, do you know what the protocols of the Elder Zion is? And these are UCLA undergrads, okay? This isn't some, I don't know, university out in the boonies. And some people were like, yeah, I think we know, but most of them, they didn't know. They just didn't know what it was. They didn't know what blood libel was. And that's when I realized that one of the problems in dealing with contemporary anti-Semitism is that we can't identify anti-Semitism if we don't understand how it manifests or the history of anti-Semitism. So I started digging around in the year about 2016, 17. What is out there? What curriculum are out there on the history of anti-Semitism? And I actually found nothing, a very, very little. There wasn't a really good comprehensive curriculum on the history of anti-Semitism. So I started to, because my passion is curriculum and education. And I said to myself, you know, I want to put together a really great curriculum for undergrads, because that's where I was at. I was at university. I put one together. Long story short, the university, the Center for Jewish Studies at UCLA says to me, we love your curriculum, but you have to take out certain parts. I said, okay, which parts? You can't, we're not going to deal with anti-Semitism in the Islam, from Islam. So the way that my initial curriculum was planned, it was geographic or regional. So anti-Semitism in America, the history of America, the history of Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the Arab world. And they said, we're not going to deal with that. And I said, okay, well, I'm not going to teach it.
When you say curriculum, this was for a specific class you were teaching, or
When I say curriculum, it was a syllabus.
Okay, so for a course you wanted to teach.
For a course I wanted to teach on the history of anti-Semitism for undergrads at UCLA. Everything was fine, except they didn't want me to deal with anti-Semitism from the Muslim or Arab world.
That's absurd.
Well, and I said, okay, well then I'm not gonna do that. So I didn't teach it. And then at that time I realized—
You didn't teach the course, or you just taught the course without that component?
What?
Did you teach the course just without the Islam, or did you not
I didn't teach the course. So the story is that I said, yeah, I'm not going to teach that class because that's not being honest to the issue of the fact of the matter is there is anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. And so then I pivoted and I said, well, what if I start looking at high schools? And I thought, what about Jewish high schools? Would Jewish high schools be interested in teaching students about anti-Semitism? So at that time I was in Los Angeles, and to make a long story short, that's when I transitioned from working with students in university to students in high schools. So I was able to teach the class in a few Jewish high schools in Los Angeles. And what I found in my experience teaching these classes, I tweaked it, is that they do not— Jewish educate, that's my passion now, is Jewish education and how to bring the story of the Jewish people, with it, the story of anti-Semitism, to schools. And just so we all know here, in North America, if you go to a Jewish high school and you say, I want to teach about anti-Semitism, do you know what the answer is? What do you think what the answer would be?
Well, I guess it depends on how you phrase the question. I mean, I went to a Jewish high school, and I'm assuming that you're expecting to say no, they don't want you to teach
It's
it,
not
right?
that they didn't say no. The answer isn't no. The answer I mostly got was, we have a really strong Holocaust program.
Right. Yeah.
And that, yeah, go ahead.
I went to high school in the 80s. Okay, so this is before, 93, when Schindler's List comes out at the same time the Holocaust Museum. So Holocaust memory was just, kind of developing at that point. Obviously, at Jewish schools, yes, they taught it. But, for us, the anti-Semitism, we were taught it, but it was very simplistic. It's 70 AD, the temple's destroyed, and it's, diaspora, death, exile, and then 1881, we have our Great Reawakening, right? So
That's it?
yes, that's how they simplified the entire exilic period. So it's not as if they taught us to believe that everyone hates us, but they didn't put any nuance into the different stages and phases. I remember distinctly my Jewish history teacher, Mr. Danoch, who I'm pretty sure was some sort of immigrant from Israel, straight out of the IDF, and the principal went down to the docks and said, "Here, you're coming with us and you're teaching." And he was certainly not qualified to be in a classroom. I remember him yammering on about Jabotinsky and Trumpeldor. So I'd actually heard Trumpeldor's name in high school. But I remember distinctly when he was talking about, the Middle Ages and beyond. And all he taught us was who was in power in the Holy Land between 70 AD and 1948. And we just got a list of, I learned when the Mamluks were ruling the Holy Land. Like somehow that was deeply
Interestingly enough,
relevant.
that's become so important right now.
The
More
Mamluks?
important well, yeah, because you need to know who ruled that land, because historic Palestine has been there for thousands of years, don't you know, Jared?
Yeah.
My
The Mamluks are the ancestors of the Palestinians, of course, right? So they could trace it.
and my Orthodox day school did not have any lessons on the Holocaust, no classes or anything.
Really?
We didn't have any classes on the Holocaust. We didn't have any classes on anti-Semitism.
But did you learn it? Did you meet Holocaust survivors and stuff? I mean, they were constantly,
I remember one time there was a Holocaust survivor that came in to give a talk to us. That was it.
Huh.
Very, very seldom was there ever. Oh, in the English literature class, we read Elie Wiesel, Knights.
Yeah, but every American read that at that point.
Right. Yeah, but other than that, we didn't really have much. Mostly it was biblical classes.
We had a lot of, I went to Solomon Schechter for elementary school, and that's a conservative Zionist Jewish day school. And yeah, our education was I wasn't trained to be a fifth column, trying to undermine Canada in support of Israel, as Mira Sukharov and other people claim was happening. But we got, Bible and prayer, Zionism, and the Holocaust. I mean, we didn't have a whole class on the Holocaust, but they certainly, drummed it in. We had Holocaust survivors come and talk to us all the time. So they certainly didn't, ignore the topic, but it was just a staple piece, the Amalekites, they're coming after us. And that's, that's how I was brought up. I'm smart enough to kind of see through when they're simplifying things. But yeah, no, I mean, that's why we need people like you doing high school curricula, because they don't have the right professionals, near as I can tell, working, on this stuff. They got people who have a degree in education, and they think that's somehow sufficient to cover these very specific Jewish topics, and it's really not.
Right. So thank you for that plug. But that's basically what I encountered when I went to high schools, as, oh, but we have this, we have a really strong Holocaust education program, as if that's, that's when the anti-Semitism begins. It begins and ends with the Holocaust, and
Right.
that's just about it. I think that people are waking up more, especially after October 7th. A few weeks ago, or maybe a few months ago, I was on a podcast, and I was asked to speak about what Jewish education should look like after October 7th, right? And the truth of the matter is that while it's a really great question, I think the Jewish education should look the way it should, regardless of October 7th. I could have given the same talk on October 5th that I gave on October 7th. And it's sad that it had to take October 7th. I mean, I guess this is the silver lining, if you will. That it has to take October 7th for people to kind of wake up. But they're slowly falling back asleep, I want to tell you.
Yeah, I don't think that many people have woken up.
People, one of the questions that I was asked during that podcast was, well, are you hopeful that things are going to change? And I said, well, I think that we have really short-term memory, unfortunately. For the Jewish people who have this collective memory, for some reason, we also have amnesia when it comes to, especially, so October 7th was what, like 2.5, 3 months ago? And I already see conversations within the Jewish space, within Jewish education spaces, of teaching from empathy, understanding the Palestinian, that basically, I even saw one webinar for Jewish educators, starting to teach about the Arab-Israeli conflict before October 7th. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Or starting to talk about Israeli-Palestinian conflict before October 7th. But then I attended the webinar, and basically the whole webinar was that for the Palestinians, it didn't start on October 7th. Their pain started before. And I just don't know what to tell you. So I'm trying to help in many ways, different schools and different religious institutions, to bring, I don't know, I call it unapologetic Jewish education, which you can call it activism, right? You could say it's activism. But I'll give you an example, okay? So for instance, tomorrow I'm going to be teaching a class on Gaza and the story of Gaza. Let me simplify, and I know that you both are historians, so
I'm not.
No, he's a political science. He doesn't know anything before
Oh, okay, Adam, you have no idea where. Okay, no, I'm kidding. But you remember, I'm teaching to high school students, so it's not the most, you can't, they're still, their brains are in a level where they can't see the nuance so much. That doesn't mean that we can't bring it in. But so what I did is I marked 3 time periods when we talk about Gaza. So Gaza before 47, Gaza from 49 to 67, Gaza from 4 periods, 67 till 2005, and now 2005 to present. And so I'm looking online at different sources, right? I'm looking at different sources that I could bring in, and I suffice to say that what we see online is completely biased against Israel. But I was like, oh, U.S. Library of Congress. Okay, so I click on U.S. Library of Congress, And the language is as follows. If you give me just a second, I'd like to pull it up. May I?
Sure.
And you guys could kvetch about Jewish identity, okay, or Jewish, I don't know, activism.
Well, the one point I was going to add about, teaching Palestinian pain, I mean, there's nothing wrong with having that in there, but to center a Jewish curriculum around the concept of Palestinian pain is a little bit absurd, right? I mean, you're not going to structure a Russian history. Again, I'm not comparing the two conflicts here by any means whatsoever, but you're not going to define a Russian history course around Ukrainian pain. I mean, that's not the way you would teach a class on Russian identity, right? Even though it's a central element to it. It's not, you can't make this solely about the Palestinians, especially if you're focusing on pain, looking at what they had done.
Right. But so I completely agree. I don't think they're centering it on, I really don't think, I think they are centering it instead of history on feelings in general.
Yeah, which is absurd. I mean, you shouldn't be teaching that in school. I mean, that's
right. So to just give you an example of the kind of education I do. Okay, so tomorrow I'm going to go teach about Gaza. All right, so I'm looking up, and I find the following from the U.S. Library of Congress. It says, quote, following the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Egypt administered Gaza, period. It was captured by Israel in the Six-Day War in 1967. Okay, so do you see the problem that I see? Okay, let me just say
the fact that they didn't stress that Egypt captured it in 48. I mean, they're using different language.
Egypt administered the land and Israel captured it. Right. I want to teach these students that, first of all, they need to know the history, but they also need to be able to detect how language is being used to manipulate us. Right. Israel captures, but Egypt administers the land. I mean, it's just a small thing like this, but this is the type of education that we need to do. We need to do the history. They need to know that from 49 to 67, it wasn't just yes, it was administered, but after it was captured by Egypt. And that's important.
And the Palestinians did not have the right to get Egyptian citizenship, right?
Exactly. That's
Palestinians weren't recognized as a nation, but at the same time, they weren't allowed to become Egyptian.
Exactly. And this may be simplistic, but I'm going to say this too. And I stress this when I teach. My question is, how come from 49 to 67, we didn't have free us from Egyptian occupation, free us from Jordanian occupation in Judea, Samaria, i.e. West Bank? These are important questions. Does that make me an activist? Well, you tell me. You're the professional historian, professional political scientist. Does teaching in this way make me this activist?
Not if you're framing it on the distinction in language. There's nothing, I mean, that's just straightforward linguistic analysis. There's nothing wrong with that. And then you open a discussion as to why this is the case, right? I mean, it's entirely a valid way of teaching. It's not activism. If you're saying, and because of this, therefore, we need to get out in the streets and condemn Egypt and yada, 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 then yeah, you're teaching activism,
right.
But you're not doing that. But that's the thing. The problem is in these departments at universities, not so much in the history department, though I think it's slowly creeping in, but in these other departments, they're training them to be activists. They're teaching them a flawed history and a flawed contemporary situation and saying, therefore, you need to take this and go join, this movement and that movement. And that's where the problem is. I teach the Nazis. I don't tell them, to go out and become activists against anti-Semitism. I don't teach them that the Nazis are evil. They're supposed to arrive at those conclusions themselves. I teach them why the Nazis came to power and why the Holocaust happened. That's what I do. I teach them the past. If they want to make analogies with the present and take action because of that,
you don't make analogies to the present? You don't make connections?
I do, but I'm very careful when I do it because a lot of these analogies, as we know, with when Trump get elected and all these actual Holocaust historians start posting that same damn quote from that Jewish newspaper that say, Hitler is just another anti-Semite. He's going to come and go and disappear. I mean, how could a responsible Holocaust historian, post that, the day after Trump gets elected? It's utterly absurd. So no, I'm very careful. And in fact, I actually do. And my students, unfortunately, don't seem to get the nuance in the point I'm trying to make, is that at various points when I teach fascism, I bring up Trump and I try to point out, okay, well, everyone's been calling Trump a fascist for the past 5 years. Let's look at these, characteristics of fascism, and does Trump really meet these attributes? And like, no, it fails by a long shot. It doesn't mean he's a good guy and he's not an authoritarian, in objective, but at the same time, don't throw around the word fascism, and certainly not Nazism. I mean, you're making bad analogies historically if you do that.
Agreed. I agree with you. Right. It's you have to be very careful when you are teaching history I think it's very important to connect if appropriate.
Yeah.
And when appropriate. But my point is that all of this is by way to say that it's been a journey for me from being in university and transitioning to high schools, and to bring to high schools, not just a history of anti-Semitism, but a history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I say this always to students, whether I teach it in the schools or online. Listen, it's not that I want to be this expert or person who educator on the Arab-Israeli conflict. I don't. I'd rather be marveling at Pasternak and Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Well, less so Dostoevsky. I'm not a big fan.
He's an anti-Semite, but I love his work.
Yeah, exactly. And I say to them, but the problem is that today's anti-Semitism is located in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And we, the Jewish people, have lived through several lies, blood libel, protocols of the elders of Zion. I think that we living through something that I call the Great Occupation lie. And we need to know very well the history to be able to combat and basically dismantle this lie. Because this is what we're living through. So that is why I teach about the Arab-Israeli conflict, is because it's about anti-Semitism.
Well, much of it is. It depends on what aspects you're focusing on, right?
On the conflict with Israel. And
I wouldn't want to teach a course specifically focused on the Arab-Israeli conflict. I would not want to do it. It's just
why
you're walking into controversy and conflict. And
I love to.
On my campus, it would be fine, but there are campuses where I would not want to do that. I would have to deal with enormous heartache. One of my professors at Berkeley, when I was back there visiting, I won't name him, but anyways, it wouldn't be a secret who it is. He said he was teaching. He decided to teach a class on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Or actually, no, it was a course on the conflict, or it was a course on Israel specifically. No, he was intending to teach a course on daily life in Israel, right? Let's get beyond everything that we read in news. Let's just talk about daily life. And he said all the Zionist students were like freaking out and demanding more Jewish nationalism. All the Arab students were flipping out and saying this course is not anti-Zionist enough. And he said, the people who love the course, the Asian students, they took it and they learned about a country that they'd never heard before. So, you're walking into a minefield, and the class I teach is Zionism and Israel. So yes, it is centered around the concept of Jewish nationalism, and I'm not sitting there judging Jewish nationalism. I'm saying where it is and what it came from and what its historical roots are and how it's manifested itself. So obviously the conflict is part of it, but it's certainly not, the center of the course. The amount of time I spend on, Palestinian identity is minimal. I do cover it, but it's not, and I have them read Alan Dowdy's terrific book on Israel-Palestine. So they are getting, the Palestinian perspective, at least from the readings. But I want to point this out. You mentioned something, you said this to me a number of years ago, maybe as much as 5 years ago, and you were right, that to understand anti-Semitism, focusing on the Holocaust is a bad idea. And you were, maybe you don't remember actually saying that, but you're completely right, because the Holocaust, for a variety of reasons, is a major exception. It's the only instance of anti-Semitism since the Middle Ages, including the Middle Ages, that has resulted in the mass extermination of the Jews. That's not the usual outcome of anti-Semitism, right? The Soviet Union is more typical. Iraq in the 60s is more typical. Things that happen in the Middle Ages, reversal of or threats against emancipation, stuff like that. But the Holocaust is, industrial genocide. It's a major exception. It's the one attempt where there was, since biblical times at least, where there was attempted mass extermination of the Jews. And the other thing is, and here's where the Soviet case becomes very important, the Holocaust, the Nazis stereotyped the Jews as both, super powerful global conspiracy stuff, which still exists today, that stereotype, but they also had the racial degeneracy stereotype, right? They looked at European Jews and said, these people are racially degenerate like Africans and whoever else. And that, my personal theory is the combination of those two things made anti-Semitism very deadly in a way that it wasn't in other times and places. And I think the Soviet experience in many ways, whether it comes from the left or the left or the right here is actually immaterial, but I think that case is much more typical. right? Not trusting the Jews, subjecting them to litmus tests, thinking if their loyalty is greater to themselves, their peoplehood, or the state of Israel, than to the states in which they live, right? Constant suspicion over them. Not sending them off to gas chambers, right? Not comparing them to animals, right? That's not how it normally works, right?
Yeah, Adam, would you like, maybe I don't know, what do you think there? I mean, I have an answer, but what are your thoughts?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, here's the thing. What I meant when I said that Holocaust education.
Oh, you mean I misinterpreted you? Okay, that's okay.
Well, you didn't listen to that is in one way, yes. That's not exactly what I meant, but I'll tell you what I meant and continue to mean. I think that Holocaust is an example of one specific case of anti-Semitism, of taking dehumanization of Jews, and as you can say, as you said, taking it to that extreme genocidal view. I do now think that it makes sense, though, that was the answer, and I'll tell you why I think so. Because if you zoom out in European history of anti-Semitism and look at medieval period of Judenhass, of hatred, of being anti-Judaism, there was a way to save the Jew, and it was through conversion, right?
Yeah, except in Spain, and that's the great exception there.
Okay. But the way to quote unquote cleanse Europe was to de-Judaize Europe. In the era of anti-Semitism, in the post-Enlightenment era, the answer to quote unquote the Jewish question, the way to cleanse Europe was to destroy the Jewish race. So it makes sense. It makes sense if we understand it that way, because you couldn't save a Jew by converting a Jew, because the blood would still be impure. The Jewish blood would be impure. But the reason that I think that it's not going to help us understand contemporary anti-Semitism is that we are not living in an era where Jews are being seen as inferior or subhuman.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the point.
Quite the contrary.
Yeah.
We're living in an era where Jews are being maligned and accused of, having these supernatural powers, of inserting their, as you say, Jewish identity. Can they be trusted? This idea of dual loyalty. And so Holocaust education is not going to prepare you for this type of anti-Semitism that we're
unless you read Jeffrey Herf's book, the Jewish Enemy, because he says this is a political thing, right? Mm-hmm. He says the racial degeneracy is important, of course, but the idea of Judeo-Bolshevism, it's very much a political concept.
I think that there's still a common denominator throughout the entire history of anti-Semitism.
Political scientist? Yeah, go on.
And that is blaming Jews for other people, for their own problems. Like scapegoating Jews, like it's the Jews' fault.
But it's not scapegoating in the sense where they know, okay, we're really at fault, let's go pick someone and blame them. They genuinely believe the Jews are their misfortune, to quote historian Heinrich Treitschke. Is Heinrich his first name? Whatever his first name was.
Absolutely. As I told you earlier, I'm reading right now with my class Martin Luther's On the Jews and Their Lies.
It's scary how he has that medicalized, racialized language, and it's only the 1500s. I was shocked.
That's exactly what I just wanted to tell you. I mean, so that's why I think that while the Holocaust is the culminate, I think the Holocaust is the culmination of the medieval period and up to the 20th century. I think, and that's the other mistake in how we teach the Holocaust as this singular event. Mm-hmm. Well, it's singular because it's so extreme, but it actually is part of the story of anti-Semitism. It's part of the history of anti-Semitism. And so it's not treated that way. It's just treated as racialized degeneracy. Well, this is what happens when racism runs amok. This is what happens when racists are in power.
Not at all. With Wilhelm Marr, it's the victory of Judaism, Judentum. I don't know how to properly translate Judentum, but it's much more than Judaism, over Germandom, right? I mean, this is a racial apocalyptic war. He's saying exactly that's verbatim what Hitler is going to say. Now, that said, I agree with you, but one thing about these 19th century anti-Semites, they didn't have gas chambers in mind. I mean, most of them were about reversing emancipation. Let's put them back in the ghettos. And, even the protocols of the Elders of Zion state that, it was the great French Revolution, which we engineered, that got rid of that structured society that kept us in check. Now we're able to take over the world through liberalism and communism and capitalism. Put them back in the ghettos. You know, that's the solution that most anti-Semites would have said in the 19th century. You know, I mean, the
Agreed.
idea
By the way,
gas chambers is beyond the pale. I mean, it was really.
I agree. Yes, of course, of course. I'll say two things. I read Wilhelm Marr. He's a terrible writer, but anyway, what was really
Most of these
interesting.
people are. I mean,
But what's interesting in Wilhelm Marr is that his answer is to, he says the Jewish people actually come from Israel. Well, he didn't say Israel. He actually said they come from Judea. The answer is to, you know, exile them back to their homeland. I was like, yes, Wilhelm Marr. You know, but by the way, Martin Luther, his answer to what do you do with the Jews is this is what you do. 1, 2, 3, 4. Bullet point number 3 is burn their synagogues, burn them. So they didn't have gas chambers in 1543.
yeah.
I was surprised to see.
Now remember, they're burning a lot of people in 1543. It's not just it was a European thing. They kind of
Yes.
enjoyed doing that.
But I was really surprised. Which my point being is that the genocide of the Jewish people is unprecedented, right? Before the Holocaust, but if I think it's still part of the larger story of the history of anti-Semitism in Europe. It's
of course it is. I'm not denying that. It's a product of the Enlightenment in many ways, in certain ways,
right.
Action to the Enlightenment. It's both of those things.
Exactly, and so when I said I don't think that's teaching or just learning about the Holocaust is going to properly prepare us for anti-Semitism, I meant just that. Also, I meant that Israel is not considered some sort of subspecies on the world stage. Quite the contrary, they're seen as powerful, and they are powerful, right? They're the usurpers in the narrative, right? They're the thieves in that narrative. They're not some sort of rat.
Yeah, except they were compared to skunks at Columbia last week, but that's the racialized degeneracy creeping back in. So
that's right. That's right.
Maybe it's not completely gone, but no, you're absolutely right. It's the all-powerful Jew. It is the protocols. It's that aspect of 19th century anti-Semitism that has survived today. I mean, yeah, you don't have these impoverished East European Jews anymore. They don't exist. So I don't know how it would be hard to make the case for racial degeneracy in the way they did in the 19th century by pointing to their stereotype view of the people in Poland. And it's not just Jews. They kind of thought anyone, you know, in the Slavic was inferior. But yeah, so that's just it. It's this supremacist, for whatever the reason is, their chosenness, if you will, their belief in superiority, and their global conspiracy. And in the 19th century, the Jews were, compared to the non-Jews in German lands and France, outrageously successful. They did better than the, you know, quote, indigenous French and German people. And in the Enlightenment debates is, can we give the Jews their rights? Can we give this backwards primitive people who are speaking this, you know, garbled jargon, who've, you know, lived behind ghetto walls for, you know, hundreds of years, can we actually give them the rights and they would actually become civilized? I don't think we could civilize them. You know, what they would say about Africans, for instance. And then fast forward 70 years and the Jews are all the bankers, the lawyers, the journalists, and I mean, it's empirically demonstrable. They were in the leading positions in Europe. So they're all scratching their heads and saying, how the hell is this possible? Hence the Jewish conspiracy.
Exactly. Jared, you said this better than I think I have ever said this. That's exactly right.
Well, I said it in class just the other day, so you know.
Oh, it's real. I loved it. That was great because once years ago, I was teaching an excerpt from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Actually, it was not the actual text. It was Ford's introduction to it, that he translated, or he had somebody translate. And he even says, he's like, I don't understand. There's no other way to explain the success of the Jew.
Karl Marx actually nailed it in a document that is considered to be anti-Semitic, but it's just Marx's crude writing, Zur Judenfrage, on the Jewish question, where he said that Judaism equals naked capitalism. Now, what he meant in his materialist way of looking at the world is essentially what my advisor, Yuri Seleskin, argued in his book, that the Jews entered modernity with all the skills necessary to flourish in modernity. In the Middle Ages, it didn't particularly help you, but you can go from being a money lender to an international banker far better than a peasant could. You can go from being a Talmudic scholar to a lawyer and a professor and a journalist far better than a German peasant can. They had all those skills that allow you to succeed in modernity, and that's why they succeeded. There's no conspiracy.
Agreed. My professor from undergrad, Peter Knez, who's
He's awesome. I love that guy. Yeah.
awesome. He always used to tell me, Naya, there's a reason there was never the protocols of the elders of the gypsies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Well, the Jews did it. They did, absolutely. Same thing in America too. They succeeded probably a generation before the other immigrants who came over the same time that they did. And people use that as an excuse for anti-Semitism today. And, I got into one dispute with someone I won't name, but their response, and they know nothing about Jewish history or culture. And it was like, everyone knows that the Jews are the most successful of all the minority white communities. So they're obviously on the left because I threw in the word white. Yeah, but it's like the most successful. And yeah, it might be true to a certain extent, but I could tell by your tone, there's this resentment that somehow we got unearned white privilege, when we needed to really work our way harder for it, right? We're being held to this higher standard, and something about the Jew not deserving what he gets. And that's, you want to connect with the Middle Ages, that goes right back to the beginning, right? So we're not really part of the noble community because we're the Christ killers. And about extermination, do you assign St. John Chrysostom at all? That's just like, a 3-page
Oh,
excerpt.
thank you so much. That would be another addition. That would be
He's one of the
good.
early church fathers, before St. Augustine, who came out with the quote moderate policy for treating the Jews. But he was, the synagogue is a den of thieves and prostitutes and criminals and this and that. And, he was all for killing them all, right? I mean, the early church debated what to do with the Jews: force conversion, exterminate them, or, tolerate them. And the moderate view ended up winning out, more or less.
Correct.
Yeah. So no, there's a lot of, you could connect the medieval stuff to the modern stuff, absolutely. But again, the Soviet case, I want to actually ask you about one thing you said about the Soviet Union early on, that your parents experienced street level anti-Semitism. We've had 2 guests on already talking about anti-Semitism in the USSR, Marat Grinberg and Isabella Tabarovsky, and they were talking more about official ideology and the books that were printed and this and that. And yeah, rhetorically and discursively, you can make the connection between what the Soviets were doing and what really the left is doing in the United States today. But what sort of street level anti-Semitism did your family experience?
Right. So you have to understand that in the Soviet Union, Russians in general, I would say, are very ethnocentric. What I mean by that is
I
that—
spent time there, I get it. Yeah, I know.
Okay, but maybe some people don't get it who are going to listen or what.
Yeah, no, of course, yeah.
So for Russians, the way that they categorize people is by ethnicity. Jew, Armenian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Latvian, et cetera, et cetera. And so Jews were an ethnicity. They were not Russian. And so, for instance, I'll give you a few examples, both examples for my brother. My brother left the Soviet Union when he was 16 years old, 15 years old. So he grew up and he would play on the yard. And when they would play war games, the Soviet kids liked to play war games. And they would say, well, you're not a Russian, you're a Jew. And he's like, but I'm a Russian, I'm a Russian. And they're like, no, you're a Jew, you're a Jew. And he would get beaten. There were street fights, and he would get beaten for being a Jew. My brother would fight back, but his case is not, singular. It was common for kids to get quote unquote beat up. One of the anecdotes that people say, how does a Russian person know they were Jewish? They found out, on the yard. They found out on the yard because somebody beat them up for their kike face, excuse my language.
Yeah.
But that was common. That was very, very common with children. Children would play these war games, and children would always say, oh, well, he's a Russian, he's a Ukrainian. And it was like there was a kind of a totem pole of who's the worst, and the worst was the Jew.
Which was not the Bolshevik intent when they set up the,
no, not at all, not at all, not at all. And of course, so yeah, my father actually recently told me that he started to work out to try to beef up. And I said, why? And he goes, well, the actual truth is because I needed to protect myself on the streets. And you think it's like a ghetto of some sorts, but the Jewish kids, they were visible, like they were visibly Jewish. They had Jewish features. And so they would get beat up. I mean, I'm sorry, you smile, but that's just how it was. So
I
that was
wouldn't pick you out as a Jew walking down the. I mean, if I were a non-Jew, I wouldn't pick you out as a Jew walking down the street.
okay. Maybe myself not, but but that was one way that it manifested. That what played itself out was with children on yards. Now, another way, I'll tell you about my father's story. It's a very heartbreaking story, but I think it's important to tell you. My father wanted to be a physicist. He's a doctor. Okay, he never wanted to be a doctor. His passion was physics. And in the Soviet Union, to get into university, in addition to passing all the written exams, you have to do oral exams. And so he did so well on his exam. So in Russia, the marks are not A, B, C, D. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 being equivalent of an A. So he got the 5s on the mathematics and the physics and et cetera, et cetera. So it comes time for him to go to his oral exams. And he says, this is what happened. They sit him down. There's like a committee of 3 or 4 professors, and they open his file. And the first question they ask him is, what language do you speak at home? Because his last name is Lekht.
Yeah.
Okay. And he didn't understand, like, why is that relevant? Why is that relevant to my wanting to get into MGU, which was Moscow State University, which is like MIT over there at that time? Like, why is that relevant to this conversation? And he said he realized, he's like, it all doesn't matter. All of this is just a big, if you call it like charades. It's all for show, because they had a quota on how many Jews can come to university, but they couldn't. So they had to take the time to, have an oral exam. And I don't know if you understand, but the implication was that his language that he speaks at home is Jewish, Еврейский, right? So like not Russian. So he didn't get in. So he didn't get in. And it's a really heartbreaking story.
These things happened in the United States too.
Absolutely. Until the late 50s. Yeah, I have a great uncle who couldn't get into medical school on his first shot at McGill in Canada because if you were a Jew, it was a known fact you needed several percentages higher in your GPA or in your whatever they called it back then, in your scores.
What happens if this kind of thing reemerges, where students want to get into a program and they're sat down to answer questions, and one of the questions is, are you a Zionist, right? A litmus test that we're already starting to see in minor ways, but what if it emerges as something larger?
You don't have to say what if, it already has happened. In 2014, a Jewish student at UCLA was campaigning for student senate. She ran for president of the student body. And during her interview, she was asked, she wasn't asked, are you a Zionist? Her name is Rachel Beta. It was a famous case in 2014. She was asked the following question: being that you are a Jewish student, how can we ensure that you will remain unbiased when it comes to Israel, Zionism, and Jewish causes?
We talked about that a couple of times on this podcast.
It was a very famous incident, yeah.
Yeah. But what I'm talking about is, I mean, it's what you're describing is bad. What happened to her is bad. It's horrible. But it wasn't getting into a program. It was winning a seat in the student government at UCLA. What if it turns into something, that prevents applicants from actually getting into programs or receiving?
But it's illegal to ask a person if they're Jewish on an admissions
But
form.
there's ways around that, though, right?
Not as much as there was in the 1930s, where they could ask, what yacht club does your parents belong to, right? I mean, in the 1930s, it was much easier to out the Jews in an interview for a university. Today, it's a lot. Once you have an obvious Jewish name, it's very difficult to pull it off. So I don't know if the quotas are coming back, but that's in the form of, DEI and affirmative action. And the Jews, and it's because
I don't think that they're going to be against Jews. They're going to be against Zionists. I mean, for them, there's a good Jew and there's a bad Jew.
Yeah.
Good Jews can get in and can win these seats in the student government. The bad Jews can't. And so you don't need to find out if they're a Jew. You just need to find out what their politics are.
Is it illegal to ask that on admissions?
There's ways that you can find this out.
Yeah,
Our Republican government,
like what
our Republican government in North Carolina, which I will never under any other circumstances say anything good about them, but they did ban two things last year. Mandatory DEI statements. You can no longer have them for job applications and for admissions until. And I was chair of a search committee last year, and everyone submitted a DEI statement. Next time around, they don't. But the other one was they banned quote compelled political speech during an interview. Now, what that means exactly is a little bit unclear, and obviously it has nothing to do with Jews with their intent. It's more like, okay, you're not allowed to ask someone what their opinion on the Civil War is and shit like that, in an interview, which is a little hard for a historian if you're interviewing someone for a history position to not get into the realm of politics. But I mean, that does prevent asking someone about their affiliation with Israel. No.
Listen, Adam, I think it's absolutely possible that this could happen. Absolutely.
When I was on the job
question
market,
of the-
I was asked questions all the time about my politics because they already knew that I was a conservative. So they wanted to kind of get a sense of what kind of conservative I was.
They asked you during interviews?
I got questions about my politics in
You gotta
interviews.
sue their asses for that.
I didn't get anything like that in my job now. But but in interviews I had gone on when I was in the job market, yeah.
They're not allowed to ask that.
Well, but it wasn't direct questions. It was more things like I had one question where
I mean, there's ways that you can ask people like, oh, what do you like to read? What news sources are? Oh,
I had one
yeah, what book?
I
What's your
was
favorite?
asked, Barack Obama, who was president at the time, gave a speech last night. How would you construct a single class around that speech?
Yeah,
That was I was asked that question, and I guess I blew it because I never, basically they ended the interview pretty quickly.
You teach political science at I understand why they could get away with a question like that in such a situation.
But Jared, I want to finish just because you asked how does street level anti-Semitism, present itself in the Soviet Union. So beating you up on the streets, calling kids kikes, and then my mother, for instance, was told by her coworker to go back to Palestine, which is priceless now. I mean, I love that now. I love telling that because you see, for the non-Jew, Palestine was always Jewish. And so Palestine, the region, was always linked to Jewish presence. So my mom was told to go back to Palestine. My father-in-law was accused of converting his workplace into, quote, a Zionist nest.
Well, that's,
So there you go. So this is how it would present itself.
He's a doctor. He was accused of converting his medical facility into a.
No, he was not a doctor. He was an engineer.
Oh, okay, all right.
But I can't help but now make I'm sorry, I keep on going. I just am reading Martin Luther. He said that the Jews are a brood of vipers. The Jews are a brood of vipers. And in the Soviet Union in 1970 something, my father-in-law is told that he's converting his workplace into a Zionist nest. How could you not make the connections of anti-Semitic discourse? But so, yeah.
Absolutely. No, I mean, and the snake, like the spider and the octopus, are traditional 19th century representations of Jewish global domination. Yeah, so obviously, I mean, Russia historically has always been, a problem, for the Jews, from the early to mid 1800s onwards. The Bolsheviks did legitimately try to rectify that in the 1920s and eventually just kind of gave up. And then Stalin came to power and that was the end of it. But yeah, no, I mean, I get that. It's terrible. There's no, in Quebec, when my great-grandparents' generation, my grandparents' generation, same thing. I mean, they would experience anti-Semitism in the streets and they couldn't get certain jobs and they couldn't get into universities. But luckily, we are not Russia. And hopefully we won't become Russia.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
Fine.
For multiple reasons. So I guess just to wrap up, since we're at the hour mark here, what's your vision of what you hope to achieve with not only your students? I mean, I looked at your brand new website, very nice website, nayalekht.com. There's a lot of stuff in there about what you do. It's not just that you're teaching high school. You're doing far more than that.
Right. So I work. So right now, what else I do is what I do in addition to teaching in high schools and developing curriculum for high schools is I work with synagogues and other schools. Right now, public schools are bringing me in or want to bring me in to do some I hate that word training. I don't want to use it. Education. Education around anti-Semitism. So that's something else that I've been doing. Leading seminars for educators on how to teach about the history of anti-Semitism. So so yes, I teach in high school, I create curriculum, but I also work with the synagogues, I work with Jewish youth groups, I work with other Jewish schools, and now I'm getting into public schools. And that's a territory that's I'm a little bit hesitant about, not because it's public schools, is that I think that it's actually not healthy and not a good strategy to pursue these forced mandated trainings. Oh, there was an anti-Semitic incident at so and such district. Well, we're gonna have to bring in so and so to do some mandatory training on anti-Semitism. That's something it really reminds me of mandatory anti-racism training, which I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
no, I agree. It's a problem.
It's a problem. So I don't know if that's really a great solution, but I know that there are public schools that I might be working with. And of course, I also publish quite a bit in the Jewish Journal and other news outlets, reporting on what's happening in terms of what I call educational malpractice in higher education and K through 12.
And you're also a co-coordinator for the Jewish Studies Zionist Network.
Yeah, we should have mentioned that right at the beginning. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
We don't take what we do lightly. Yeah. So yeah, no, that's very important. Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, in terms of this training, I mean, it's all bullshit, and everyone who has to do the training knows it's bullshit, right? And the people, most of the people, not you, but most of the people who construct the programs, don't really know what they're doing either. But I was asked, a number of years ago to actually, to speak to a high school class about the history of anti-Semitism. I think they were mostly 10th graders, 9th and 10th graders. And it was a great experience. I mean, they really, again, I'm in North Carolina. There's hardly any Jews here. They're not anti-Semites, but they don't really know of the Jews except
They're just not Christians. Jews are not Christians.
Well, they're the people in the Bible, they're the chosen people, I'm an evangelical country, so they are the chosen people in certain ways, but they don't really get anti-Semitism. They're not Catholics, and they're not around a lot of Jews. So I found it very useful. I'd love to be able to go around to the public schools and give that lecture. It was very interesting and enlightening, and I think a lot of the college students need it too, because they really don't know anything about it. I mean, today they read modern anti-Semitism. They read Treitschke, they read Marr, they read the Protocols, and Drumont, the French guy, and their eyes were just, they were really awakened by it. They couldn't believe the stuff that they were reading, and it's like, we're not at the Holocaust yet. This is still before World War I, but listen to the language that they're using. Like, just look at it. Right. Adam, any last thoughts? Any last questions for Naya?
You wrote an article. This is a completely different subject. You wrote an article in the Jerusalem Post that interested me a year ago or so, suggesting that we need to embrace faith more. Do you know the article I'm talking about, the op-ed?
No.
Are you sure it was her?
I don't think I would have. Yeah, can you be a little bit more?
She's a Soviet Jew. I don't think, that the faith is in their vocabulary.
Religiosity.
But I don't know if I would have really. I think that I'm not sure. Something I advocate for, or something that I really believe in, is that Judaism is not just a religion, it's an ethno-religion.
Yeah, and everybody, mostly.
Okay, but you say everybody, but Jared.
Well, you know what I mean. I mean, the people in our circle who swing in our circle.
Yeah, but this is when you said, what's your vision, Naya? My vision is to remind American Jews and Jewish establishment that we're not just a religion, because they don't understand.
Yeah.
They think that, it's a Judaism, it's a religion.
That's the reform movement's line. It's the official American line, and the reform movement embraced it.
So I don't know, maybe you're referring, I did write something called I am a Jew because I'm a Zionist. I'm a Zionist because I'm a Jew.
That piece I remember.
Was it? I don't think that was it.
Well, I don't remember. I'm
Sorry,
sorry.
I was hoping that when I said it, it would trigger it, but
You did say once to me years ago, and I do remember this, that you said that secular Zionism has no future. It has to have a religious dimension to it. You did say that to me. That I remember.
maybe that was it. Yeah,
How would you know about that? It was something she mentioned to me in a conversation years ago.
I read something that you wrote in the Jerusalem Post. I even shared it on social media.
I don't remember it. I'm sorry. It's
Yeah,
terrible.
well, I don't remember
But
everything.
this is a huge topic, but I really don't think that secular Zionism is viable. I think that Zionism, Zionism is an unfortunate word. And the reason it's unfortunate, according to me, is that it is very much, it pegs it in the 19th century tradition
Mhm.
and brackets it as solely a political movement. And that's the ism. And so when I teach about Zionism, I say we're going to throw ism out the window. We'll revisit it, but we're going to actually go back to Zion, the root of the word, because Jews have been Zionists before. Something that I've been playing around with lately is the idea that, for instance, Shalom Aleichem was a Zionist, and maybe Yud Lamed Peretz was a Zionist, and Yehuda Halevi was a Zionist. Okay, but the language didn't exist before.
It depends what you mean by Zionist, right?
It depends what I mean by Zionist, but I'll just finish with what Yud Lamed Peretz, the Yiddish writer, one of the forefathers of Yiddish literature, has a story called Drei Matones, or Three Gifts, and it's a really, really powerful story. It's short. It's a similar collection with the other story called Bon Sheshvaig. I don't know if I'm sure you guys have heard of it.
Spiker. I haven't.
So this is called Three Gifts, and ultimately, it's the soul can only return to heaven if it can present the angels in heaven with three gifts, and the angels will decide if the gifts basically will be accepted in heaven or not. So the soul basically wanders, this kind of wandering Jew, for thousands of years, looking for these gifts, and one of the gifts that it brings to heaven is a little bag of soil from the Holy Land, from Jerusalem. Now, how did it get this little bag? It floated over this little hamlet, over this little Jewish town, or a town with Jews in it, in Poland, and found that these burglars broke into a Jewish man's home, and this Jewish man's really poor, and they're there to steal stuff from him. And they think he has something because he's hiding something. He as the burglars come into his house, he basically falls to the ground and he says, not this, right? And they kill him, they slit his throat. And then they look and they're like, a bag of soil? And the narrator writes, well, this was soil from Israel. He died for it. And this little soul decides to take this little bag. That's Zionism.
Yeah, without the political dimension, right?
Okay, fine, not the political.
No, but you're right. I mean, well, I can't speak. Obviously, the 19th century it was there, but I mean, Judah Halevi, yes, he defined himself at the end of the day with his, famous quotes about, his
My
destiny.
heart is in the East.
Yeah, I mean, he at the end of the day, despite being the probably the greatest ladies' man in Spain, who achieved the pinnacle of success that someone can in Spain at that time period in every respect, picked up and just disappeared and went back to Jerusalem during the Crusades. I mean, who the hell does that, right? Because that's where his heart was. It was his homeland. But he wasn't trying to build a state, of course, because it's the era before nationalism. But yeah, I mean, I suppose we could use, I mean, again, that's being a little anachronistic to use the word Zionism in that context.
It is. But it's
the connection to the ancestral homeland, right? The Jews never severed their ties, and it was central to their mind in a way that it is not for other ethno-national communities, which tended to develop in the 19th century. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So no, it's very important. Absolutely. On another occasion, I have to talk furthermore about how Shalom Aleichem was a Zionist.
Yes, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on that. But we probably should wrap up. Adam has, bestowed an article upon you that you may not have actually written, and
Right, I feel so bad.
I need to find it. I was sure that once I mentioned it, you would, but I don't think I'm mistaken. But
are you still publishing monthly at the J Post?
No, I need to get back to that. I actually have something that I'm working on right now, but not monthly.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to publish articles on a schedule. It's not, you know, I feel inspired, I write something, and then I can go months without writing anything.
Right.
All right, well, this has been a terrific episode. We are going to sign off. Naya, do not hang up when I say goodbye. I usually tell, you know, people beforehand, but I forgot to mention it this time. We've had a few guests just, you know, turn off, you know, sign off when I say goodbye, but, you know, I want to chat for a couple of minutes afterwards. So that's a taste for the viewers about us managing things behind the scenes here. So this has been a really, you know, terrific and insightful episode, and it's great to hear about how people like you are working with pre-college students, which is seriously necessary. Both
Sounds like pre-diabetics.
pre-diet, yeah. Well, I mean, given the way universities are going, that might be a good way of putting it. But even in the Jewish schools,
Right. Well, we need to do preventative measures here.
Yeah. I mean, even the Jewish schools, they do need a better, you know, education coming from people who are trained with PhDs. I mean, that's something that is sorely lacking in most Jewish schools. So it's very important in that sense.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for the kvetching. It was good.
Yeah, we got some Kvetching in. It's important. And some clips.
All right. Thank you
All right.
very much.
Thank you so much for a wonderful episode.